do território da UFABC. Com isso, eu gostaria de apresentar a professora Wendy Jepson, da Texas A&M University, do Departamento de Geografia, que ela vai fazer a apresentação sobre Household Water Insecurity Experiences, Perspectives from Research in Brazil. A professora Wendy é doutora em Geografia, é professora titular da universidade no Departamento de Geografia e trabalha com essa temática de Water Security desde 2008. So now in English. So thank you for being here. This is part of the workshop on urban water security in Brazil, from infrastructure to social action, promoted by FAPESP and the British Council and the Federal University of ABC and University of East Anglia. So we'll have Professor Wendy Jepson from Texas A&M University presenting for us her talk on household water insecurity experiences, perspectives from research in Brazil. It's going to be a 15-minute talk, and after that we will be open for questions. So thank you, Professor Jepson.
Okay. Thank you so much for honoring me tonight and giving me this opportunity to address you today at the beginning of this wonderful workshop. I'm a university professor at Texas A&M University, and since 2016, since a Fulbright semester at the Federal University of Ceará, I have been a visiting professor there as well. I am very pleased to be able to participate and give this keynote talk tonight at the invitation of Dr. Empinocchi and Dr. Buds, two colleagues of mine who I've known for a very long time. And I'm looking forward to spending this week listening and learning from all of you as we consider how to advance scholarship on the diverse topic of water security. Por mais metade da minha vida venho ao Brasil. E como pesquisadora e também eu tenho família aqui. Eu morei também em São Paulo, em Mato Grosso e também em Ceará. Estou muito feliz por ter a oportunidade de falar com vocês hoje. And so, if any of you have questions later in Portuguese, I'm happy to accommodate. I do speak a little, as well as English, but I will continue on in English today. So, slide please. My journey in water security research has started about 10 years ago when I wanted to understand why low-income communities living along the rural and semi-urban areas of South Texas were struggling for water. Not only did the work need to address this myth of universal water provision in the United States, a discourse that dominated water management, but I had to think about new ways to discuss and describe and assess what I was seeing and hearing from my colleagues. Water was costly, inadequate, and of poor quality. Many people were cut off. Many people shared water with neighbors through informal arrangements such as water hoses, and all relied on relatively expensive bottled water, which was really creating a significant problem, not only in terms of cost but conveyance. This was really quite baffling. You see, since the 1980s, when politicians in the state of Texas recognized the severe problem of water insecurity along the border, they, along with federal government, invested over $1 billion in infrastructure. And some say that it's more than $1 billion, up to $1.5 billion. So how was it that residents continue to suffer for water? To try and understand this paradox, as part of my research, I also realized that unlike food insecurity, there was not a metric or a way to assess objectively water insecurity. And while reductive in many ways, developing a metric would complement ongoing research among community members, activists, and water managers. Previous metrics around water insecurity only focused on one dimension, It really was defined by water access. And maybe to a lesser extent, water distress, as Amber Wooditch examined in Brazil at the time. So to fill this important gap in the social scientific literature around society and human development, I wanted to finally develop one metric that could help me understand the experiences going on along the border. And I also included in this development the lessons learned from food security research, which argued that we not only need to incorporate objective measures of water insecurity, but also subjective measures of water insecurity, which I'll include in a second. So the household water insecurity scale, which the first I developed, was important because it allowed me to demonstrate empirically and not simply anecdotally that the colonias, as these settlements are called, do not only form, they don't form a homogeneous group of water insecurity, but there's differences among them. Moreover, we were able to then describe and quantify differences along this border region, whether it's in the south tip of Texas, which you see in the video here, in the map here, with the concentration of colonias as green dots, or in El Paso, which is several hundred miles away. Slide. So not only did the work that we did in water insecurity research from a qualitative standpoint allow me to describe what was going on, we also were able to discuss what were some of the risk factors. And one of the surprising conclusions that we came to using the quantitative data was to illustrate that immigration status was a major predictor. And while we know that this was surprising, at the same time it does follow what Karen Backer talked about, that ties water access to citizenship and water provision. This work also led other important findings and critical scholarship on environmental subjectivity, technology, and neoliberal water governance. The project's qualitative objectives allowed me to examine technical devices in the water sector, focusing on what Furlong calls these mediating devices. And in my work, water vending machines and household water filtration devices were seen as two technologies that could ameliorate chronic problems of unacceptable drinking water provision. And I argued, however, that these devices are not panaceas to water insecurity, but technologies of rule. The introduction of water technologies redirected limited resources to individual market-based technological solutions, and it didn't allow for water governance beyond the individual. So one paper described how institutional enclosure paired with water quality discourses and daily practices operated over time to enroll these low-income citizens and residents as neoliberal subjects. And I argued that this process resulted in the production of a water consumer rather than a water citizen. A second paper examined point-of-use household water filtration devices. Now, we use the metric to argue that these devices indeed exacerbated, in some cases, water insecurity because they increased household water contamination, required more money, time, and skill and labor to adopt and maintain. So these mediating devices not only masked the slow violence of chronic water insecurity behind technological hubris, they undermined colonias residents' vision of themselves as political actors in water governance. So this work, both with empirical and theoretical lines of inquiry, led to a collaboration with Amber Wooditch and Sarah Young to think more deeply about the meaning of domestic water in terms of multiple dimensions, the implications from our own work, from them looking at medical anthropology and from my perspective in political ecology, as well as from the perspective of broader goals of human development. Now, our initial collaboration started in 2015 has become a community of practice that we call the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Research Coordination Network, which we call HWISE because it's really long to say. So our HWISE network is now a community of over 60 scholars from 25 institutions cutting across the globe. Indeed, many of our members are from the Global South. And I'm encouraged to see vibrant international collaborations and conversations like this one turning around and turning into and forming an emerging area of water insecurity research. And I hope that this conversation we have this week certainly moves the goals forward of HWISE. Next slide, please. Together and along with active steering committees, and I would like to say Dr. Mpinocchi and Dr. Buds are also on the steering committee of HWISE. We really hope to then build a global community, and today I hope to showcase the emerging approaches to address some of the most hidden and poorly understood dimensions of water insecurity. And I hope to illustrate how my own research in Northeast Brazil contributes to this new understanding and critical reflection on water insecurity more broadly. So my task today is to lay out a research agenda which emerges from our hard-earned insights from a decade of research, reflection, and collaboration on water. After a brief introduction, I'll first walk you through some of the important surprises that emerged from my own long-term water research journey and how it influenced the trajectory of inquiry that has led me to these questions I've been asking today and in Brazil. I will then dive into the ongoing work and focus on two examples from the field. One is a small urban center in the Sertão called Forquilha, and the other is Pecém, an urban area in the metropolitan region of Fortaleza. I close my talk with some reflections on frontiers, challenges, and opportunities, returning to, but probably not resolving, the tensions at this intersection of critical work, social scientific inquiry, and operating in the space of science and policy dialogue. I situate my work at several analytical intersections. These intersections of empirical grounding and theoretical engagement, a place that I consider deeply generative and creative. And I hope you will see by the end of my remarks the multivalent approach to my scholarship and the water insecurity research more specifically, and how it builds a platform for new ways of thinking about not just simply water, but about human development, how we as a global community can foster the advancement of human capabilities. So let's begin at the very start. Why do we need a new approach to water security, and urban water security more specifically? Urban water security strategies commonly pivot on supply-side initiatives to mitigate scarcity, forecasted population growth, or anticipated climate change. In the Global South, urban water security research largely follows the parameters of techno-managerial strategies, almost exclusively attending to water supply for large metropolitan regions. But as Hoekstra has mentioned in his review of urban water security, the question, security for whom, often remains unanswered. Recently, scholars have begun to expand urban water security by leveraging alternative frameworks that incorporate equity into the analysis. Mark Zeytoun, for example, calls for a reconstitution of how security is defined and seeks to extend critical analyses beyond urban infrastructure to include interdependent hydrosocial securities and systems such as food security and energy security systems. Several scholars, such as Rutger Bolens, have argued for new perspectives to examine how urban water security strategies unequally transform the urban and rural gradient into new hydrosocial territories. Hydrosocial territories are structured by water control and infrastructure, their boundary and institutional arrangements, and ties to and among different actors and natural environments, which certainly include a reconfigured urban-rural hinterland. And as urban areas seek to secure water, water reallocation and transfer projects do transform rural communities and environments in myriad ways. As Holmes have argued in 2019, this would allow for a better analysis of the power relations, inequities, and representation issues regarding rural-urban water transfer projects. And I certainly adopt this in my own work in Texas. Hydrosocial territories are compelling. And I've recently published a paper that looks at how institutional change, contested views of water, risk, and groundwater science determined and shaped the new politics of a rural urban pipeline between Houston and rural Texas. But today, I'm going to present another story. one that takes a focus and a laser focus on the equity turn by opening the investigative aperture on urban water security research conceptually and methodologically. So in today's talk, I will demonstrate how my work here in Brazil advances this agenda and what research and policy insights are generated in this process. Cutting across the examples I will present today, I address the question of water insecurity for whom, and turn my attention to the urban resident and the focus of urban water demand, the urban household. There are three analytical threads I want to weave through my talk in the two short case studies that I'll present from the Northeast. First, I argue that there is a need for an analytical switch to focus our attention to household water demand and water use. Households considered a fundamental social unit are certainly quite diverse, but they provide an entry point to the question of water security for whom. Centering on households and the everyday experiences of hydrosocial relations within urban environments allows us to look at the complex interaction between water-urban governance and its failures and the cascading and variegated consequences for household water security experiences. For many, this is a normative goal and why we do our work. I certainly am going to bear my bias here. I ground my scholarly work in the ideas of equity and fairness and human development, that it is to generate and facilitate human well-being. And so from that perspective, it to me is quite logical to start and focus on the household. And as I've argued recently, a central capability of human development and a central capability of well-being is the ability to engage with and benefit from sustained hydrosocial processes that include the breadth and scope of water flows, water quality, and water services in all of its social natural complexity. Water is not simply a resource, but should be understood and analyzed as co-produced hydrosocial flows, services, and meanings that support the achievement of human well-being as defined by individuals and their communities. Thus, attention to household demand explicitly attends to water services intimately tied to human development and the human right to water. So my focus and the focus of many scholars in HWISE then is insecurity, because that speaks directly to the question of equity and access underpinning our work and the demand analysis from the household level. Extending this broad view, I adopt a conceptual framework that integrates multiple dimensions of water insecurity, which includes access, quality, emotional or affective dimensions, and even social cultural dimensions. Water insecurity is a relational concept. Water insecurity is a concept that underscores the interacting and co-present, uneven, and cumulative physical and psychosocial experiences of hydrosocial relations. Thus, a broad framing advocated by Backer and Cook is holistic, and it allows for this analysis and allows for complexity to be incorporated in our own research. Water in the everyday life of citizens throughout the global north and the global south is complex, and hopefully that broad perspective will allow us to think more critically about those relations more broadly. And so this again is to illustrate how water insecurity can cascade through multiple dimensions of human well-being. So the next question is, how do we do our work? And I'm an advocate for heterodox approaches, mixed methods. And I think all of the above needs to be incorporated in our toolkit in order to get at some of the questions that we're talking about. So not only an interdisciplinary approach, but also we need to be heterodox in how we approach our own research and what we do and how we understand knowledge production. So I'm an advocate of data, and I'm an advocate of quantitative data. And so I want to talk a little bit about how quantitative methods can help us understand relational household water insecurity. First, it allows us to compare and identify, compare different places and households and communities, to draw generalizations, and let's be honest, numbers, well, that's the language of policymakers. So if you want to have impact in a policy arena, being able to speak their language helps greatly. And so at the household level, people, as we've seen, are very creative in how they access water. And so what we've been able to do in the HWISE community is, and we have developed a database of 8,000 households from 27 different countries. And from that database, what we've been able to do is ask certain questions. And one of those that I will give the credit to Amber Wooditch and her work, has led the way in trying to understand the dynamic of water sharing. And so what we're able to do from a quantitative perspective is look at water sharing across countries. And so in this slide here is drawn from a paper led by Alex Bruis from Arizona State from our collaborative. And this shows how water sharing is operative in 85% of 7 selected countries in Africa. And so today, while water sharing is an under-studied area, it's important to see how it's growing, not only in terms of understanding household water security and insecurity, but as a way for households to manage their own homes in the face of poor access. Yep. This is another paper that we've seen in our most recent work, looking at the larger sample of 19 countries of low and middle income countries. And it shows, again, not only do we have households across the globe participating in this, but we can start to ask questions of what are the drivers. And so in this paper, we've explored that as well. But I also want to add that our work, again, is interdisciplinary. And as Justin Stoller, who's from the University of Miami, has argued in a recent paper in International Health, that while water sharing is important, we need to understand it very carefully so that it doesn't create additional burdens on already water insecure households. So not only do I advocate us to think broadly about the kinds of methods quantitatively, but I do, of course, embrace qualitative research. Interviews, observations, diary methods, and structured recall can be used to systematically assess how water is being obtained and how households are experiencing the lack and the configurations in the water provisioning systems that we've talked about today. And so to facilitate a more precise focus on household measurements, oftentimes these qualitative methods are quite important. And so what we see here is from our colleagues at REACH at Oxford University, led by Dr. Sonia Hock, and she has built on what Amber Wooditch has started, which is a water diary method. And in this way, her work has demonstrated that by this fine-scale assessment using water diaries, we can look at the complex patchwork of how unpiped sources can fulfill household needs and begin to ask further questions about how households are able to access water. Yet, conventional research methods may be inadequate to capture the core dimensions of water insecurity experiences. We need to expand our methodological toolkit to research that reflects an expanded and relational notion of household water. And I seek to argue that we need more phenomenological approaches, such as photo voice. Photo voice is a participatory methodology in which the researcher turns the camera to others in the field, oftentimes research subjects. And it really changes and shifts the topography of research in significant ways. The methodology that I've included in my own research project has sought to understand and describe hybrid household provisioning systems, investigate how households navigate through this complex configuration of water distribution, and evaluate those systems in terms of water security. And photo voice enables people to document their own lives, promote critical dialogue about community issues, and in some cases, reach policymakers in unconventional ways. As one researcher has noted, photo voice is a way to literally see beyond the colonial images of poverty and dystopia that characterize informal work in cities in the global South. And the conversations and interactions that are present in photo voice open space for communities to engage each other, to engage researchers and policymakers, and target social change. Photo voice and other visual methods highlighted the ways that water contributes to the intangible elements of the human experience in ways that are nonetheless critical for understanding human well-being. Consistent with a capabilities approach to water security, this focus includes attention to diverse meanings and significance of water in people's everyday life and what it means to be a citizen and to belong to a community in those affective and emotional relations. And so in this photograph, it allows us to dialogue with this underlying ethics of water. And in this case, the culturally and socially reinforced notion of communities in the Northeast, that no one ever refuses water to their neighbor. This allows us to dialogue on the affective experiences of water, and in this case, the complex construction of emotional or affective responses to water, and in this case, water quality challenges. And with this particular research participant, we had a very long discussion about showing these photos because she was quite embarrassed with what the water has done to her home. And so having those conversations are quite important. And this method allows for those conversations. Photo voice allows us to dialogue about the affective experiences of water. In this case, a dimension of water security held by many individuals and households that were involved in our work. And in this case, we were able to pull and understand more specifically this environmental valuation, understanding that water is not just about health, it's not just about human activity, but really having this underlying environmental ethic emerge in our conversations. Next. Thank you. So I want to talk about this because it's really critical to think about how we do our work. And again, embracing a multi-method approach to that. So what I'm going to talk about next is a quick case study in Ceará, next. And in the case of Forquilha. Yep. So moving forward, I want to illustrate some insights from my own work in urban water security in the Northeast. And this work was conducted by a team from the UFABC, Jader Santos, and now Dr. Paola. And their names were on the previous slide. And so I want to focus on these examples because I think they're quite important. First, we're going to talk about Forquilha, which is a small city, and then the second, the urbanizing community adjacent to the industrial port of Pecém. And in both cases, the research was conducted during the last major drought, which started in 2011 and ended in 2017. And while the state of Ceará is Brazil's largest water distribution and management infrastructure in the Northeast, urban populations remain vulnerable to periodic droughts. Large metropolitan areas are often protected over smaller urban centers, and across different cities, we do see unequal access of water. So in this first case study, I turn our attention towards the challenges of water insecurity outside major metropolitan areas and coastal capitals, to the largely marginalized small urban centers, those that have fewer resources to respond to increasing external pressures on water sources. In Brazil's drought-prone semi-arid region, for example, these cities are important. They're home to about 9.2 million people living in cities with less than 50,000 people. And there's another 1.5 million people living in cities that are between 50,000 and 100,000. And so in this work, we're able to get at those small cities because they have particular challenges. So an aspect of this project that I want to detail quickly is the cumulative challenge of water insecurity from the perspective of the household, and quantitatively demonstrate that. Like the other small urban centers in Ceará, our study area provides an opening to detail the complex struggles of urban residents in these small urban centers during this severe drought. We conducted our study in the urban center of Forquilha, a municipality that is representative of many, many areas in the semi-arid region. With the history of modest development, CAGESI, which is the water utility, has described that they cover 99% of urban residents in this location, and thus most residents meet the international benchmarks of access defined by the Joint Monitoring Program. Yet, like many others supposedly connected to water utilities, everyday experiences of water insecurity persist, and for many worsen under drought. So what we see here is we did a study of 211 households that were distributed equally through the city, What we were able to do with that survey, and it was quite complex, it was quite long, but we were able to articulate the various ways, again, quantify the various ways that households were able to access water. And for those of you in the back, I apologize for the small font. As I see, it's difficult to read, but I'll talk you through it briefly. The major takeaway of this graph is basically 1% of the population used the water from Kajesi to drink. And the remainder drew water from several different sources. Protected a water well, which was a public tap, a standpipe. There were 3 standpipes that had a desalination system and 7 others that did not. There was a bottled water access, rainwater, and other, which would be like a kasimba. And what we see in this case is that under drought, and this region has experienced, obviously, drought in the past, that the water management system moved the water from various sources. So initially it was from a reservoir, which was built by DNOX, which is the federal system to build reservoirs, and then in 2009, in response to a drought, shifted to river water in a pipeline. So during this drought, just to give this context, it started in 2011, and by 2014 and 2015, residents were complaining about their access to water. And at that point, the water was being drawn from the river went dry, and the water, Kajesi, went back to pull water from the Asuji, from the reservoir. And what we see in this case is that that water was contaminated, it had cyanobacteria, and it was unsafe to drink. And even though Kajesi did provide systems to try and clean the water, they actually did admit that the water wasn't safe to drink. And so under those conditions, this is what you see. You have a very important role of multiple systems that emerged. So the residents were using their water for multiple sources. Next slide, please. And we were able to understand more the complexity of that experience. And so in this case, what we were able to see in the top graph is the percentage of income that they paid at that time. And so you can see some neighborhoods, the poorest neighborhoods, obviously spent the most percentage of their monthly income on water. And you also have here the ways in which they conveyed water by foot, bicycle, motorcycle, car, wheelbarrow, and delivery. And again, this case illustrates the diversity of water conveyance and the burden on households. Next slide, please. So we can describe this in general for the city, and the story goes on. We can see how water affected affordability. There were implications in terms of who did the labor. Now, what's different with other cases, this was a male activity. If we look at gender division of labor, men were involved. And we also were interested in understanding the emotional aspect of this. And so this next slide illustrates some of the impacts on how people perceive themselves and how they felt about this. So this aspect of emotional distress is important. Terms used included stress, fear, anger, and anxiety, and annoyance. And for some residents, even if the water was fine, there were concerns about the water in terms of impact on health. And so one respondent stated that he was afraid of the water, that it would cause kidney stones, and others were really concerned about becoming sick from the water. And so what we're able to document here is another important aspect of household water insecurity, is that subjective view of how they were experiencing the crisis. Women avoided fetching water at night, of course, for fear of gender violence, as well as there were thefts as well as conflicts in the water lines as well, which I'll talk about in a second. So that describes the general experience of water in Forquilha at the household level. However, what we're interested in understanding is the cumulative impact on individual households. How do these various dimensions aggregate for individual households? How do we understand this? I'm happy to talk about the statistics behind this after the talk today. I won't go into those because that could be like 2 hours. But what I can say is that we did a factor analysis based on 22 of our items in our survey and pulled 8 different factors that were important that really described about 72% of the variability in the sample. And so the various factors we named, so these were the various elements that emerged that were important for us to then understand water insecurity at that individual household level. So insufficient supply, access, safety, distress, water quality distress, water quality, social educational costs, physical limitations to water, and water budgeting. And we then calculated an index, which was standardized to 0 to 1, 0 indicating low water insecurity, 1 to high. Next slide. And so with this standardized index and with some more statistical analysis, we were able to kind of categorize these households based on those 8 factors. So as we can see, about 25% were either moderately water insecure or severely water insecure. But this still didn't tell me what I wanted to know, so go to the next slide. So we took those data and broke it down even farther. And so in this graph, which again, I'll walk you through, tells us a lot about what does water insecurity look like at the household level. I want to highlight that the red line, that's a circle. So each one of these is the median value of the index for that category. And we took each factor in that category, looked at the household that was in that category, and looked at that median value. And what that told us is that household water insecurity is not equally composed. So for those households that are water insecure in the most severe way, the red outside line, you can see that most of those factors are significant. But what I do want to highlight are 3 points that can illustrate this a little further. The water quality distress factor is equally, and that's the one on the far right, is equally, if you look at it in terms of progression from secure to insecure, or the least insecure to the most severe, is relatively experienced equally, and that becomes important. But if you look on the other hand to the social and educational costs, and those items included questions around problems having your children attend school or not attend school because of water problems, or have those water problems prevented family members or yourself from participating in social activities, they're the same for those who are in the low and marginal and moderate scales. It was specifically that change which kicked people into a severe category. So what we're saying is that not all of these various experiences around water security are evenly divided. There are some that we call threshold characteristics. And so that ended up being one. Water budgeting is another category which moved people from moderate to severe in a significant way. This is important for policymakers, and what did we learn? So next slide. So I didn't go too deeply into this, but what we started to see is small cities were dependent on informal vendors, and this actually exacerbated during the drought. You started to see a rise of not only informal vendors, but you also started seeing a rise in the ways in which people organize their lives. Moreover, a driving factor of how people changed and why they changed their behavior was based on emotional distress and based on their concerns and fear. And that played an important part. Not all dimensions were equal, which I just described. And then finally, the policy targets, you can identify those at thresholds. So for example, what we would have argued is that at this time, water availability, affordability programs should be instituted, which would bring people to a less insecure status. In addition, this concern around water quality and targeting that with policy and investment in the small city would be appropriate. Next slide. So that is one small case, and again, there's a lot of work that I didn't present today, but I want to show you one more case, which looks at the regional metropolitan area in Fortaleza, and at this point, I'm going off my notes. Next. And I want to talk about water security versus water securitization. And again, this was in collaboration with my UFABC colleagues. So this project was one in which, of course, we did our survey in 3 neighborhoods in the regional metropolitan area of Fortaleza. One is in Sabiaguaba, which is a marginalized community, one which has irregular land tenure, Mundumbi, which is in the city, almost in the city center, and then Peseng, which is on the outside of the industrial area, or of the major settlement of Fortaleza, but many of you might know Peseng as being a port. Next slide. So during this drought period again, the state was interested in securing water for Fortaleza. The state government developed a water security plan, which focused entirely on securing supply. Not only did the discussions range, I mean, there was some discussion around water demand management, really was about supply. The narratives that we've heard before, thinking about desalination as being an option, looking at different aspects around groundwater extraction, and looking to new surface waters that they can pump in. What's really important about this strategy is the last two, extraction of new groundwater as well as extraction of surface water from intradunal lakes. The extraction of groundwater and local surface water was justified politically, and this goes back to some debates I'm sure here in São Paulo that you've had around rationing. It is politically impossible to do rationing in Fortaleza. Just is. You can't do it. And so in order to mitigate that, the state created and tried to identify new ways. And in addition, not only was it not to do rationing, but we have to understand, next slide, where the water was coming from. So I'll go that into a second, but I first need to talk about this. This is the Port de Pecém. It's an industrial center, particularly steel, which is the steel factory, which is one of the largest factories in the region. It requires a lot of water. And it requires a lot of water from the system that also goes into supplying Fortaleza. Next slide. So this is the water supply system. And it goes from the Castellão, which was a picture I actually had at the beginning of the talk. It goes through a series of conveyances to supply not only Fortaleza, but there's also an Eixo das Águas, which then goes on to provide water for the industrial port as well as the steel industrial complex. Next slide. This is the urban center of Pecém, which many years ago was a small fishing village and now is growing. And next slide. That's where their water comes from. It's an intradunal lake, surface water. They don't receive any of the water from the Eixo. This is their primary source for supplying the water to the city. I do want to note on the back in the dune there, that's a esteira, that's a conveyor belt that conveys iron ore from Carajás and coal from Africa, and it goes directly into the industrial complex, right actually kind of behind us. And that's an important component in this story. Next. So in our research and in our household survey, we identified that 60% of the population, the urban population, again, our survey has a 90% confidence interval to be able to describe the entire urban area the way we did the survey. And almost 61% of the urban residents use groundwater. But then if you look at the data on where the groundwater, if these are registered groundwater boreholes, they're not. This is all informal. And what we see is not only are they reliant, 60% of them reliant on groundwater, 22% used for drinking, and you have, I believe, I can't see because my numbers here, like around 35% for household tasks. Next slide. This is also identified in our work, which is a communal or a shared borehole. And we see, again, those that are managed throughout the communities. And so groundwater has become an important component of the suite and provisioning system that they've developed over time. Next slide. And the reason why they did it is because the surface water, which was effectively polluted by the esteira and the materials that were being blown off and into the lake. And so in our discussions and our qualitative work, we would hear stories about how water used to be good. It used to be of high quality. We used to get the service we wanted. And what we started to see is that people started to self-disconnect. So these are communities that actually had water from Cagesi, receiving water from the system. And because of the quality, the intermittency, the cost, they just preferred to go to their groundwater system. And so you started to see a process of self-disconnection. So what do you think is going to happen when you have the state saying they're going to develop these high 35 industrial-sized wells to pull water from the groundwater and put in the Eixo das Águas for the steel mill? These were, again, very deep wells, large vertical shafts, and they had this great plan. And it was all about moving the water from the groundwater system, the aquifer, into the Aishom. Next slide. You had conflict, and you had a social response. What I found very interesting, though, is that the social response was not some sort of generic or generalized argument against the state, but it was driven out of this realization that they felt their water was under threat. So a system that they had created in response to the industrialization of their community and the pollution to their source water was then now being undermined again by this move to supply the steel mill. And so you had protest not just by irrigators and farmers, which you certainly did as part of the coalition, but you also had urban dwellers. Next, please. And it did get violent, and it did get significant attention. I'm not sure how much of this news made it here to São Paulo, but it certainly was quite significant in Fortaleza. Next. And this is a poster that we would see throughout the city in the neighborhoods where we worked. And if the city was fully being serviced by Cagesi, why would there be an issue? But the reality is, and again and again and again in our interviews, is that they were terrified that this system was going to take away the only source that they trusted. And so you had a social movement emerge. Next. As I mentioned, not only did the social movement organize around the groundwater wells, but also around the system to extract water from these interdunal lakes. And so what you did is have a protest where community members who relied on this source of water decided to start an acompanhamento right on top of the infrastructure to stop any further construction. And this lasted for many, many, many months. But actually it worked. And they did have some success. It has been at least stopped for now. Also worked through the Ministerio Público, and many of us have read articles on the role of the Ministerio Público in the environmental sector. But what we see is that there was a response based on this experience in a political realm. And so these 35 wells were stopped, at least in this case for now, paralyzed. So this brings me to sort of some final conclusions and sort of new directions. Next. And a question mark too. Next. So where does it lead us? So I think there's a few points that I want to make, and I'm going to look at my notes to make sure I don't miss any of them because I've gone off script for about 12 pages. I think one of the issues is sort of what have I learned on this journey and what might be things to think about. So I want to outline a few ideas that might generate some discussion this week and maybe even be ways in which we can integrate them into some of our writings. But the first thing is, how do we do our work? So it's not just about methods, and I'm very much interested in methods. I draw on the empirical data, but it's about how do we do our work, and that's what I mean by the social relationships that we develop in the places that we do our work. Right? Do we go in and extract information, leave, write articles, and be done with it, or do we create longer-term relationships with the communities that we're involved in and the partners that we have in the field? And so I think that if water and water insecurity or water security is a relational concept, we also have to be relational in that as well and not transactional. And that then emerges out of the kinds of methods we use and the way in which we approach our work. And I think for me, thinking creatively about not just the methods, but this question of the research and the social production of knowledge and the co-production of knowledge is important. And so this question of how needs to always be at the forefront of what we do. Next slide. Water security for whom? So I'm very interested in this concept of labor, and that theme has come up already in the discussions we've had today, and maybe we can take that thread and weave it through some of the conversations throughout the week. Who does the work of labor? How do we understand the work of labor? And what are the implications for equity and justice? Next slide. Yeah, I do want to show this is the team of students who do work with me in the field, and again, this goes back to the how question. I think I've transposed my talk points, but that's okay. And finally, so for the other aspect of urban water security research, which to me I'm still grappling with, and I think again we've talked about it even today, especially with Jessica's question around the ethics of community-based water provisioning. So we have to rethink, what is the role of the state? What's the role of communities? How does that work? But then what are the questions of equity and justice that then emerge out of that relationship? How do we think about, for example, self-provisioning and self-disconnection? We know cases not only in Pesquisa where you had self-disconnection, but in places such as Tijuana in Mexico, where it was staying away from these systems because the state was failing. So how do we balance these issues of centralized systems which provide theoretically large social benefits, but at the same time understand that these systems are also political and also social and do allow for communities to have some sort of water autonomy and water sovereignty? And so how do we understand that, and as researchers integrate that into our own work? And so that is a third point, is one I don't have an answer to, but I certainly know, and I think many of you have echoed this as well, that the centralized standard hydraulic model isn't viable for many places. But what is the outcome? What is the response? What is the final, or perhaps not, what's the solution or outcome? And I think those are questions that I would love to talk with everyone about during this week. Again, those are questions that I haven't resolved on my own. So as I wrap up this talk for this evening and reflect on really this wonderful opportunity to share my work with you and to talk to you about my journey, I want to think about a couple different things. And so collectively, this goal is to transform how water security is understood and achieved. Building on this excellent work that many of you are doing now and many have done in the past, we can then argue that we need to go one step further, however. And by this, what I mean is, what are some of the relationships that we need to build? What are some of the ideas that we need to add to this mix of debates today and tomorrow? And how do we create and maintain sustainable water access? And so what are the skills that we have that we can bring to bear on these questions? These solutions, I think, are out there. They're already out there. It's for us to identify them and talk about them. And I really want to hear more about the opportunities that present with this group, as well as present us in terms of our research. And so thinking about the research as a process and not as an end. Because these solutions are really important. They're being done already, and it's our job to identify them and think about them in community. So household water insecurity is a very young field in which core concepts, methods, and solutions are just forming. It will be impossible to pursue the vital questions emerging in the field, the practical challenges of improving people's water security and well-being without the participation of a wide range of scholars like yourselves. By working together and towards this goal, and in putting our knowledge together and thinking creatively, I don't think that I do believe that moving forward we can transform these ideas, both in community and in the written form, so that we can continue this work together and attain water justice for all. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Wendy, for this great talk. And we have 40 minutes for questions and to think together. So I would pass the microphone to people that would like to make questions. So any questions? Or I can start asking questions and then you go after me. What do you think? So Wendy, really thank you for this presentation. It brought an amazing material, the format of the material, the combination of methods, the reflection on the concept. And I was thinking through your presentation, and one of the questions that came out was, what kind of strategies should we think, not just as academics, but also working with technicians, to not just to translate, but to present and to negotiate and to reflect about the data that we are, and knowledge that we are creating throughout our research. This is one point. I noticed how important and how much attention you gave to the format of data that you presented. So the graphics and numbers, like you said, we need numbers to impact policy making. So I would like to hear a little bit more about this. And on the other note, this workshop works on this direction too, is how to collaborate from different researchers from different countries. And you, as a researcher that have been doing a lot of work here in Brazil and developing knowledge on the Brazilian context, what would be your strategy to get to the Brazilian technicians or to the Brazilian academia to dialogue and to construct together this knowledge? If you have already questions, then we can do like more 2 questions, and then Wendy.
So can I do these 2 and then go? Okay, because they're big questions.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure I get them. I think get to this. The second one I think is a little bit easier, and we'll go back to the first one. So the second was how to do the work and how to engage with the Brazilian Academy. I think the first thing is that I can't emphasize enough my partners at UFABC, my friends and my colleagues, and that we work through these mechanisms. And so right now the material we're writing is in English, and we're also writing it in Portuguese, and we will be obviously publishing that in country. But in addition to that, I think the other issue is to identify key constituencies that we can speak to. So in the broader region, we do go back to the communities. So in Pesang, not only do we already return the results to local community organizations, did presentations, but now we're returning to do another round of photo voice. And one of the things maybe that goes to that first question is that photo voice is great, but it's hard and it's complicated, and actually we learned a lot doing that first round. We did photo voice in Saviaguaba and in Pesang. And what we learned was that people are not used to cameras. That's an odd thing for us to give cameras. And that ended up being, well, we didn't give them, we lent them, have them for a month, etc. And so because we had a great team and we had also young students on the team, Carlos Lucas said to me, "Doutora, why don't you just use WhatsApp?" And I was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." So we're doing another round with a different group of people, and we're using social media because people are more familiar and more comfortable. And so again, it's dialogic. You have to always go back. So this notion of doing a one-off study is, I think, what we do when we're graduate students. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. But as you move forward in one's career, you can commit more time and more energy to have that dialogue and learning. So I think that's certainly one thing that we've done about kind of that first question, which is the notion of a dialogue. But then secondly, taking that information, and once we're combining it, we will go to policymakers in Pesang. Now it's very tricky, as you can see, politically. And so we also have to be very cognizant on what our community members want us to say. So we are not autonomous in this regard. We do have that dialogue to make sure that we're not putting anyone in a position that's politically uncomfortable, especially because we do work with community organizations, and they don't want to get necessarily on the bad side of the industrial complex, because they do want to maintain some ability of autonomy and not being pulled into the political gravity that operates in the region. So I think being cognizant of those issues is important. But the critical point is having longer term sustainable partners. So for those of you who are in the UK, I encourage you, if working in Brazil, to know that when you commit, it's like you're committing, and it's not easy, and you need to continually think about how to work through problems and challenges, because they'll always present themselves. So that's why when I talk about how do we do our work, I always think of water security research as about understanding these relationships. Well, we're also part of that as well. And so that's one thing that I've tried to do in my own work. So I hope I answered your 2 questions.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very important to our challenge this week. And when you mention the methodological challenges in the field of water security, what do you mean? Is related to data's, kind of data's, because the methodology is very challenging in interdisciplinary areas like this one. So I would like to understand what are you thinking when you said that.
So if you have a concept that's relational, how do you study it? How do you get at some of those complexities that are maybe non-material aspects? And so that's why I brought in this notion of photo voice and some of the visual aspects of it. I think it because it's multidimensional, based on your research experience and also based on your discipline, you're going to ask sort of a set of different questions, and those questions are very important. So health outcomes are absolutely critical to understanding some of these impacts. And so if that's what you bring to the table, I think that's important. But to dialogue with anthropologists and to dialogue with political economists to understand maybe the broader system and how that health might tie to these other dynamics is important. And so the questions of methods are critical because you not only have to know what you do, but you also have to learn others' methods. You may not have to do it yourself, but you need to be conversant in understanding those other ways of knowing and trying to create space to see those connections. So that's, I think, what's really quite challenging. I think we're good at what we do, but it's also being open to what others do and open to other methodologies that you can then find common ground on and try to tie in with common concepts. So those are some of the challenges that I see. I also think that maybe not necessarily in this room because we're self-selected. However, I'm always fighting the battle of water security as defined as water access. And so, because access is kind of, it's you can define it and you can measure it and it's JMP and like that's how it's standardized. And so the other challenge is fighting the standardized ways in which the aspects of insecurity have been constructed. And so we've worked on looking at scales, we've worked on thinking through different methodologies of representation, but always trying to push that it's not just access, it's a whole suite of experiences around water.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really very interesting way of presenting the issues. I advised a French student, Anne-Laure Collard from Sirat, in a case where she stayed in the interior of Ceará, in Quixeramobim, and I went there. So it's interesting to see that the word security is part of the people living in those regions. Definitely, because they have to survive, and that was even before the program, the big national program of 1 Million de Cisternas, no? So people have a real engagement into a logic of knowing about the constraints and dealing with water security. So that's a large part of the semi-arid region in Brazil. No? I believe Forquilha will be around those areas. No? But when it comes to urban areas, the word water security only really arose stronger during the water crisis and basically into the academic community or some social movements. So definitely, and from the data you presented, the research, the field work that was done, we see that somehow all these communities, at least in the rural areas, have a different understanding of the problems, no? And then in Pesem, which is in metropolitan Fortaleza, no? So I wonder, where is the turning point to be dialoguing with the word water insecurity without creating panic within basically urban stakeholders? No, I think it's an issue that we have to think more and more, because our authorities, due to their irresponsibility, created panic. Basically because they didn't take preventive measures. So this brings us to a discussion of how to strengthen through different types of research, and maybe it's necessary to do more ethnographic research at the urban areas, so we can have a stronger repertoire of arguments to stress the importance of water insecurity.
Yes, thank you. I think in the case of Forquilla and the quantitative data that we have, it's possible to use the term insecurity, but we need to pair that with a possible solution. So that's why delving into the index rather than having these categories of insecurity, like that's not helpful, but actually seeing what were the triggers of insecurity, what were the dimensions that were pushing people from moderate to severe or marginal to moderate. And so in the paper where this is, the full analysis is going to come out, what we do is have some policy solutions, and they're ones that are possible. So, for example, when I didn't go into here in detail, but the rise of informal vendors created a vendor mafia around the very limited standpipes that had a desalinator. So there were 10 public taps that were available throughout the city, but only 3 were available for human consumption. And so what we're saying is that we can identify that dynamic as pushing residents from being marginally insecure to moderate or severe. And so the policy solution is to manage those better, is to have people paying attention and monitoring how these standpipes are being governed because of the capacity for co-optation. We can also look at affordability. That was another dimension of the whole dynamic. So with that then, how do we talk to local, Kajesi, for example, and say, hey, is it during drought, how can we think through ways to make this affordable? How can we reduce the cost? Because that will move people from severe to marginal in a very significant way. So I think pinpointing specific actions to pull them away from that threshold, then crossing it, is a way to use the term, but not necessarily instill fear, because you can at least get that dialogue going. I think the problem is if we just say, oh, people are insecure, so what? Like, what are we going to do about it? So it demands that we have to dig further into the data to be able to get to that point. And so with this particular paper, those are some of the policy outcomes that we've identified. And now that the severe drought, and I can't express enough about how severe this was. The reservoir that I showed was at 2%. 2% when we were doing this. This was a grave situation. We're out of that emergency, and even though there's always challenges, I think this is actually a good time to start talking about it, because they're not kind of in that middle of the crisis. It's going to happen again for 2 reasons. A, it's the Northeast, and B, climate change. So having it now, I think, is an important thing. But I wouldn't step away from the term insecurity. But we need to be careful on how we deploy it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy, for your comprehensive talk. That was really interesting. I have two questions, which are quite well leading on from Pedro's question. First, you mentioned, I think when you started to talk about Brazil, moving away from security and starting to talk about securitization. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on that choice, because I think there's also a conscious decision not to adopt the term securitization because it comes very much from political science, and it has this connotation of securing against an external threat, which is often something like climate change, which is then positioned as the key factor, or drought as the key factor, which then obscures a lot of the other dynamics that you've drawn attention to so well in your talk, the relations rather than contextual conditions that are often blamed, I suppose. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. So not security, insecurity, but security, securitization. And my second question was, I can see in this work that you've drilled down really in detail into the household level, which I thought was really good. But earlier on in the talk, you talked very much about these different scales and this kind of Boulan's notion of hydrosocial territories. Mm-hmm. So my question is, by drilling down more into the household, how do you kind of, in a way, drill back up to these other scales that connect so well with the relations, the territories, these other dynamics, these other decisions that are affecting how people secure water?
Thank you, Jessica. So the use of securitization is the way that I want to frame what the state is doing, because it is about what the state is seeing as an external threat. And I wanted to contrast that with the dynamic aspect of what residents in Pesang were doing, which was in the response to failing water quality, higher increases, higher costs of water, and then their response was to diversify their water portfolio and then drill down. So they're trying to respond to, as well as, an ad, drawing on water sharing as a mechanism for securing their domestic needs. So I wanted to draw a distinction because of the ways in which security is used. So in the state plan, it was called water security. But in my interpretation, it's water securitization. And what was going on in the households and in the communities was what I would call water security. And it's processual and relational, and that changed over time in responses to the changes in water quality. So this then goes to your second question, how to scale up. And so I think, while I didn't go into the quantitative data in the way that I did with the first case, we do have that for Pesang. And one of the take-home points which I did want to present, which I did present, is this predominant reliance on groundwater. And how, while Bolins talks about these rural-urban hydrosocial territories, what I think this work might illustrate is that there's also a hydrosocial sort of sub-territory, which is subterranean, and that becomes also part of these new hydrosocial territories, is also the water underneath. And so the household contention and their reliance on that was fought through their reliance on subterranean water. And so these new territories are also being recreated, but also through the use of an extraction of groundwater, and that became the source of contention. So not just outwards, which is what the rural-urban gradient is, but I want to think maybe about a surficial and subterranean gradient as well. And that the political response to the securitization plan is an example of how that scales back up because of that particular reconfigured relation to groundwater during that period of time before the drought, but in response to the polluted source water that they were using through the system. So we can make those connections, but it requires that we not only do a good job in understanding what's going on in the household through our methodologies, but that we take a step back and place it within this larger context of changing water regimes at these multiple scales. And so it was important to understand how groundwater was being extracted to be integrated back into this échange das aguas system. And so there's a way to tie that into the household. We just had to go through the groundwater to get there. Does that help? Okay.
Thanks. So I had sort of two questions as well. So one, I think, is just asking for a point of clarification.
Mm-hmm.
So with the in Pesane, what was the discourse or the way that the need for those
Mm-hmm.
So if the proportion of residents affected by the water issue is relatively small, it almost seems to be, well, too bad. This is too economically important and too many people have their jobs here. So they're really overlooked. So just, do you have ideas about those two?
So for the first question, the discourse was quite explicit that this water was going to the échange das aguas. The discussion was that it's so that Fortaleza wouldn't have to ration. I mean, it was quite explicit. I think that the point of contention around how it was represented was when they were drawing surface water from the interdunal lake. That was initially proposed as supplying water to urban residents, but quickly changed. And the change, I believe, in one of the permits was for municipal, and then it went through a process whereby it was switched to industrial. And so the public face on that project was initially for urban population. The protesters for that were the residents who lived in that vicinity, and it was also tied with an indigenous recently recognized indigenous group. And so it had those politics overlaid into the protest. What was more stark that was about the kind of urban population was the well drilling, because the governor was happy enough to say that they were doing this for the industry. And therefore, Fortaleza didn't have to do rationing. So from a discursive, you had kind of two things going on, but that was a dominant one that kicked off into some of the protests. In terms of labor, it's a great question. I actually don't know. I don't have that answer. In our interviews, we didn't seem to run across that argument from the people we chatted with, but it could. We just didn't find them, but we didn't. I didn't run across that, but I wouldn't want to say it's yes or no. But it is important to see kind of what the population's invested in terms of employment. It's interesting, though, that many of these residents have been in Pesane since before the industrial development, and many of them are like, yeah, they're disconnected from that economy. They do other things, and they have seen that their environment has been degraded, and that's something that they talk about. Now, that might be a theme because they know we're researchers looking at water and that they want to focus on those topics, so I wouldn't want to say that that's an exclusive discourse, but it didn't come up as being a reason for leaving it alone. I think people were more organizations that one organization we worked with, we were very careful in how we presented it because they did receive funds from the steel mill for some of their operations, and so they kind of wanted to stay out of it. But individuals, I didn't run into that.
Boa noite, professora. Thank you very much for your presentation and also for your paper that we read, and it was very inspiring. I would like to ask a question. First, before, I wanted to say also that I thought it was very beautiful the way that you did like a field research and to capture somehow like the cultural vision of the population to water, and also the way that you gave voice to the people in the research, their perception with the sayings and also the pictures. Also the way that you showed how a social movement achieved the possibility of fighting with something with a lot of power inequality, but even in this situation they could organize themselves at least until now. But my question is addressed to the topic of, and it's also like a question for the workshop, I think, like how do we can work together in the global north and the global south to understand this question for water security to whom? And I would like to give an example that happened in Brazil, famous example, which is Rio Doce in Mariana, which is like provoked the big water insecurity to like a population of the river, not just Mariana, but until Espírito Santo. And it was made by a Brazilian company, which is Samarco, but Samarco is controlled by two other companies, which is Vale do Rio Doce, Vale, which was Brazilian, I mean, it was a state company before, but it's not anymore. And the other is a BHP, which is like a British-Australian company. And I imagine like how this information of what happened in Rio Doce arrived or didn't arrive there, like if people know what happened. And because when you were saying, I was also asking like, oh, but this the steel of the industry, like who is buying this steel? So there is a Martinez Allier, this political ecologist and economist, and that says, speaks about the how the mining, not just mining, but extractivism, the exportation of these natural resources, as also exportation of environmental impact, and in this case, water insecurity, right? So I know it's a big challenge, but I was wondering how the HRISE network could work in the direction of dealing with this so complex and so big question.
I think you framed this exactly right. And in fact, I haven't written that component up because it's a little daunting in trying to tie it into these global processes, recognizing that the key actor in this is a global actor. So this operation is Brazilian and a Korean, and you know, the ore is coming from Carajás, the coal is coming from Africa, and it's being exported to the global north, most likely to the US in many cases, especially with some of the challenges with China. So the larger global steel industry has shifted, and so this is moving into a global economy. So I think that the challenges for us, so as academics, is to make those linkages. So as I said, the household's the entry point, but it's not hermetically sealed from everything else. It's the place where we can enter into these conversations, but I think it necessitates scaling up, and maybe that's what Jessica's question was trying to get at, is trying to sort of tie it to these larger political economic dynamics which feed into those relations. So as scholars, I think we need to be cognizant of these relationships that go, that tie economically and politically the global north and global south through these material transformations. And so in the case of Pesang, it's the material transformation of of Amazonia where the ore is being extracted. It's the transformation of these hydrologies in the place of production. It's in Africa where coal is extracted. And so I think our job is to not stop at the community edge, but to really tie it into these larger processes. And that requires opening ourselves to work in collaboration with economists, political scientists, to try to map those relationships in a detailed way and getting the right data. And you know, we're not all experts at everything, and so that's where collaboration comes in. But I definitely think that in that particular case of Pesang, those global connections, those material transformations are quite stark. In the context of Forquilha, the reason why it was an accident that we were doing our study in the middle of the drought. That was not intended. Really, it wasn't. But what it did allow us to do is speak to the future, right? And so it's not just to the typical northeastern drought. This was the worst one in like a century. And it's going to happen again and more frequently. So we can look to the global environmental change in the context of Forquilha. But again, it requires us to think of it and to situate the cases within those broader flows of materials and change.
Thank you, Wendy. Wendy, I would like to hear a little bit more about psychological reaction to water insecurity. The two cases are quite different. I think I just imagine that in Forquilha, people is used to fight for water. To get water, it's a continuous struggle. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that in Pesang, the water is there. To get clean water, it seems to me that it has historically been very easy. I do remember that in the big droughts in the semi-arid, people would migrate to Fortaleza in order to protect themselves from the drought. There's a big difference in this case, in the face of how difficult it is to get water in the two cases, in the psychological reaction to instability.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Forquilha first. So the data I presented to you is part of a larger data set. We also did 190 surveys in the rural area, so we were able to compare them. And what we found is that urban areas were more insecure than rural areas. So this is exactly the inverse of what you would expect in the Northeast, because precisely the history is of migration from rural areas to urban areas, especially during drought. Part of that in our analysis that there's a material and a psychological difference. So the material difference is that you did have cisterns, so that made a difference. So the beneficiaries, now the challenge we have is that everybody that we were in the survey had been beneficiaries of the Agua para Todos. So it's not like we could compare it to those who didn't have it. But what we found is that was, from the perspective of the household, an important component in their water security strategy. In the urban areas, this distress of such a change, so they've had challenges, but they've always been able to kind of reconfigure their household provisioning system in such a way that they were able to manage it. This got so severe that it was stressful in many different ways. So stressful from questions of quality for their health. There was considerable distress around the demand to convey water from the standpipe to the home. This was compounded by how people conveyed water. So if you had a car, you could convey like 4 times the amount of water than if you had a bike or if you had to walk. And so those who didn't have access to cars, those who didn't have access to the money, the financial resources, it really compounded the stress. And so even though in the city, even though it's the Northeast, and we think that there is this convivencia com a seca, it's still in the city very stressful when the systems are breaking down. The rural areas not only have a different kind of framework, but they did have the infrastructure that helped them through these times, which the urban areas didn't. And so in that case, it addresses those kind of dichotomies. In Peseng, I think the stress that was emergent was more about the future, right? So they had, we had some levels of insecurity, but in the dialogue, it was about what's going to happen, and so that's an element that we don't have in our survey, but it's about looking towards when our water is gone. Vai acabar com a nossa água. Right? That was what was being said again and again and again. And I think that created a whole different dimension of stress, which we hadn't initially thought about. Again, it was not in our plan to do the survey during this moment in time. So I think in that context, there are mechanisms and sharing traditions and a water ethic that buoys households. And what they were concerned about was the destruction of that through the groundwater extraction. Mm-hmm.
So I would like to thank you, Dr. Jepson, for your talk and sharing your experience with us. And I also would like to thank you all for your questions and for your reflections. So thank you very much, and we keep talking.